Oh, look, it's a chicken visual.
There's never really been a time when it's been socially acceptable to defend Griffith in online discourse. The violent emotional response you get from Berserk fans at the mere mention of the character's nuances and sympathetic motivations means that people like me who defend Griffith's actions can never get a word in, and we're constantly confined to the outskirts of the community, ostracized by all. And at first glance, this reaction is understandable. The sheer weight of the horrific actions Griffith went through with, and the pain and suffering he caused for the countless people he affected, makes it really hard for a lot of audience members to see him as anything but an irredeemable monster, whose evil had always been there from the start. This makes it incredibly difficult for them to analyze Griffith from any kind of objective position, and the visceral emotional response at any mention of his name makes it essentially social suicide to make any kind of attempt to spread the honest truth about him. That is, human Griffith is not accountable for any of the horrors of the Eclipse. I can already hear the keyboards typing, but hold your horses. Now, when asking a Guts stan whether Griffith did anything wrong, you'll usually be met with a few grunts and hisses, and then the same old diatribe about how Griffith signed a deal with the devil to sacrifice all his soldiers and friends in exchange for near limitless godly power. And once he attained that power, his first move was to rape his best friend's girlfriend in front of him. You'll also get some bullshit about how he was always a beta and viewed his men as pawns, but I already debunked that in another video, which you will go watch right now if you haven't. And it's this part, the bargained of exchange made between Griffith and the God Hand, that I want to focus on in this video. You see, among Griffith haters, there's a noticeable ignorance in their understanding of contractualism and informed consent. They seem to think that the mere fact that Griffith accepted the God Hand's offer by chanting the words, "I sacrifice," proves that Griffith is accountable for the deaths of his men and everything that came afterwards, and that it's his fault. Now, to tackle this flawed logic, we have to understand that this agreement between Griffith and the God Hand is a contract, with offers, terms and conditions, and a ritual of acceptance. Now, the philosophy behind the validity of a contract isn't so simple as a guy simply signing the paper. If it was, then we'd live in a pretty fucked up and coercive society if you ask me. You see, in law today, we have certain rules and requirements a contract must meet in order to be considered valid, as a means of protecting the rights of the accepting party and as prevention against uninformed recipients being taken advantage of. Now, in order for a contract to be considered valid, there must be an offering party which lays out the terms of the contract and an accepting party which of course accepts those terms. Most importantly, however, there must be what is known as a meeting of the minds, or mutual assent. What this basically boils down to is a demonstration that both parties are talking about the same goods and services, and that they both understand what they offer and receive. Now, at face value, this seems to apply soundly to the agreement at the Eclipse. The God Hand, being the offering party, laid out the terms of the contract to the accepting party, Griffith, that in exchange for the sacrifice of his men, he would be granted raven black wings and the power of a god. This seems to fit the definition of mutual assent, as both parties were willing and understanding of the bargained of exchange. However, and this is a big however, there are certain limitations to the validity of a meeting of the minds, which must be addressed. Limitations that can form a good defense to a breach of contract, absolving the accepting party of all responsibility. According to O'Flaherty law, a contract may lack consideration and validity if the accepting party suffers from mental illness. This is because they may not possess the necessary capacity to fully comprehend what they are doing and the consequences of forming a contract. I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, as there is no way in hell Griffith could be considered mentally competent enough to be able to give informed consent to the God Hand's offer. This is a man who had just gone through an entire year of ceaseless torture in the Wyndham dungeon, being subject to mutilating, branding, boiling, flailing, and even acupuncture. All in the knowledge that he would never get out of that situation, and that all that he had built up to preserve was gone forever. This is the kind of experience that breaks a man, and we see that visually on display. Griffith shows almost hysterical frustration in his inability to move or speak, commits random outbursts of confused violence, and experiences prolonged episodes of dissociation and hallucinogenic visions, during which he has no awareness of his external surroundings. Most damning of all, however, is his attempted suicide about 10 minutes before he was coerced into signing the contract. A man clearly experiencing suicidal intent who had been fading in and out of consciousness intermittently was in no fit state to agree to any kind of bargain. And the fact that the God Hand chose this moment to offer the choice to sacrifice, it's clear proof that they took advantage in such a way that puts the burden of accountability all on them. Not only that, but there is clear evidence of direct God Hand interference on Griffith's psyche, as many of the visions Griffith is shown are sent directly by them, further contributing to his insanity and separation from reality. I'm a poet and I don't even know it. Even the way the Bayolet only activates at the owner's most mentally unstable point indicates that the God Hand's operations are inherently coercive by design, which absolves every apostle of responsibility as well, if you care about things like morality and informed consent, which most Berserk fans obviously don't. So in this sense, the bargain to exchange was not met and Griffith is not accountable for the sacrifice. But there is another valid objection to mutual assent, and that is if the accepting party is a minor. I often got this sort of comment in my initial video defending Griffith, that he isn't a child anymore, so he fully knows what he is doing and is therefore accountable for all his actions. This of course makes sense, as a child's naivety and lack of developed understanding of the wider world severely hampers their ability to comprehend the consequences of their actions, and so they can't reasonably be allowed to consent. What's more, the vulnerability and innocence of a child means that there is such a power dynamic between a knowing adult and an unknowing child that any kind of mutually agreed consent between them, especially sexual, is too exploitative to be considered valid. In this sense, it is even more so the relative imbalance of understanding between parties that makes an agreement coercive, and I would argue quite controversially that the relationship between a suicidal, emaciated man in a hallucinogenic state and seemingly omniscient eldritch beings is a much more severe power dynamic than between an adult and an unknowing minor. These are beings with the ability to control minds, who know every facet of Griffith's history and motivations, with the ability to manipulate memories and present Griffith with misleading visions. When the God Hand insists that Griffith's rise is fated and that it's the will of God for him to accept the sacrifice, how can Griffith protest? It's with this extreme power imbalance that the God Hand were able to commit the third invalidating action of a meeting of minds, lying about certain terms of the contract. After gaining Griffith's trust by presenting him simple truths about his history and motivations, framing themselves as pure truth tellers and emissaries of God's will, Slan decided to manipulate Griffith by claiming that the Hawks would consent to be sacrificed. Usher up an image in the mind of an afterlife and experience after death, where the Hawks would realize Griffith's intentions and would forgive him while celebrating his successes. By playing into this half-truth and cryptically referring to the collective unconscious and idea of evil, Slam manipulated Griffith into believing the Hawks were okay with being sacrificed, as informed by the fact that she could read their minds. Obviously, the Hawks didn't actually consent to be sacrificed, and so the conscious manipulator and willing agent of evil bears accountability for their deaths, that being the God Hand. But it's not only the lying that proves the God Hand's manipulation, it's also the much more subtle obscuring and omitting of key conditions of the contract that Griffith was not made aware of. Any follower of this channel will know that my main defense of Griffith is the argument that Griffith and Femto are essentially different entities, and that in this sense, human Griffith isn't at all accountable for Femto raping Casca. I justified this separation by pointing to the side effects of the transformation, as well as by insisting that pre-transformation Griffith would never have raped Casca, only doing so after the idea of evil artificially stripped him of his ability to feel human compassion and effective empathy. If you're unconvinced by this argument, then I'll point you towards my previous video where I explain how Griffith could never have hurt Guts in this way out of spite as a human, and why his advance on Casca in the wagon wasn't attempted rape and cannot be used as a parallel to the Eclipse. A common criticism of this argument, that Griffith's personality was altered and so it wasn't his fault, is thrown towards my way by creating a parallel between post-transformation Femto and a drunk person raping someone while inhibited. Just because someone's personality may be altered under the effects of alcohol, doesn't mean they're absolved of blame, right? So why should Griffith? There are two problems with this argument. The first is that the transformation was a permanent change to Griffith, not some temporary sesh with the boys. The second is a little bit more complicated. You see, intoxicated sexual assault is an ambiguous topic in terms of identifying accountability and blame. How can you condemn and punish a sober person for having committed a crime while intoxicated? Their inhibitions were lowered, and they had a lowered awareness of their actions and the consequences of said actions. How can they be made accountable for anything they did while under the influence? It doesn't necessarily reflect on their sober self after all. The way we get around this in a court of law is through the legal concept of voluntary intoxication, wherein the defendant is held accountable for any action they take while under the influence because they willingly made the choice to become intoxicated with full knowledge of the substance's effects on their behavior and the potential risks associated with that. That is what makes you accountable for committing crimes while you're drunk. Now, you might say that this applies to Griffith because he made the choice to become Femto, and that is why he is accountable for raping Casca. But he actually didn't. He only chose to become Femto in terms of the physical power that would come along with the transformation, and raven black wings. That's all the God Hand ever explained to him. Not once did they mention in the terms of the contract that by saying "I sacrifice," Griffith was willing to lose his effective empathy and human compassion. Griffith didn't know about that effect of the transformation. He had no way to know of that effect of the transformation. It was entirely in the God Hand's ball court on whether or not Griffith should have been informed of that, and they chose not to say anything. In fact, they never brought up anything about psychological changes in any capacity. But the main piece of irrefutable evidence that Griffith did not willingly choose to lose his empathy is his words during the transformation. Let's take a look.
I am buried under the weight of all those bodies. How strange. I can't feel anything. What's that? The very last tear you shed.
Griffith clearly expresses genuine surprise when he discovers that his ability to feel empathy towards his men is being taken away from him. If Griffith knew exactly what was going to happen, why would he have this reaction? It makes no sense. He doesn't know and therefore does not fit the criteria of accountability according to the legal and moral definition of voluntary inhibition. The only time he's told of it is after the fact by the idea of evil, and it's a little late by then. Now, there was one argument put forth to counter this by my good friend Elite RE, who makes some great in-depth analysis videos on the Attack on Titan manga, which you will check out once you're done watching this video. He argued that Griffith is accountable for becoming Femto in this sense, because he did not do his due diligence in understanding the ramifications of the transformation contract, and didn't suspect the possibility of anything being kept from him, and so it is his fault for not asking about potential negative consequences. He then described an interesting hypothetical in which a paralytic person is approached by an unknown billionaire at night, who offers to sign a contract which binds the billionaire to fix the paralytic and pay for any treatment required in the process. They look all dodgy, with tattoos and bad breath. RE argues that the paralytic should be obligated to ask if there are any negative consequences to signing the contract, or be made accountable for any of them manifest. I'd completely agree with this, but the hypothetical doesn't fit the Eclipse. You see, Griffith and the Eclipse would have no reasonable cause to doubt the words of the God Hand in the same way the paralytic person would with the billionaire. In the case of the hypothetical, the meeting of the minds hasn't been met in even the most basic way, as there is much less of a mutual understanding of what each party will offer and receive. The billionaire offers this money with no catch, no return payment, and nothing to gain from the transaction. Therefore, the paralytic would have good reason to suspect foul play, because shady billionaires don't go offering money around for free out of the public light. With Griffith and the God Hand, there is much more of an understanding of the mutual benefits of either party. The God Hand will offer him power in exchange for sacrificing all he loves dearest. That is the negative consequence in this scenario. That is the payment. That is the catch. It wouldn't even come into Griffith's mind to think, what else? Especially considering his mental state at the time. What's more, asking whether he would have his empathy taken from him as a condition to the contract would be an incredibly random and unprompted thing for Griffith to say, akin to asking whether the moon would implode as a consequence of his decision. It just wouldn't enter the mind considering Griffith knew literally nothing about the nature of apostles or God Hand beforehand. God Hand beforehand? Griffith can't be blamed for losing his empathy here, and so he can't be blamed for his rape of Casca. Everything bad that happened in the Eclipse Eclipse, from the death of his friends to the torture of Guts to the rape of Casca and all the trauma that came with it, is the principal and sole fault of the God Hand from both a legal and moral perspective due to their manipulation and the coercive imbalance they held over the accepting party. The contract is breached and Griffith did nothing wrong, quite literally. Now I understand this conclusion won't be accepted by most. A lot of people are too caught up in their emotions and living their lives vicariously through Guts to see Griffith as a human character worthy of sympathy and respect. But I hope that the few people who do listen to my words with open ears will take these arguments and spread them through every corner of the community, and share this video around to make an effective counterbalance against the sometimes hopeless tide of Griffith slander. We can change the discourse if we try. I'm looking at you, Ascaja. Ladies and gentlemen and non-binary kings, thanks for watching the video. It's part of a broader series I'm starting in defense of Griffith, salvaged from my scrapped hour-and-a-half long video responding to Griffith haters, so stay tuned for it. Bye.